Most church-goers didn't notice how the organist's eyes followed certain visitors who never stayed for the sermon, or how he watched the side exits during collection time. They just wanted to hear beautiful music. They had no idea they were listening to someone who once tracked financial crimes that funded international terrorism. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden expertise and moral vigilance, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. St. Michael's Episcopal Church had been serving the downtown community for over a century, its Gothic spires rising above the business district like stone prayers against a sky full of glass and steel. Inside, beneath stained glass windows that painted rainbows across wooden pews, the Sunday morning service followed rhythms that had comforted generations. At the organ, Thomas Wright began each service the same way, adjusting his bench, testing the pedals, arranging his sheet music with the kind of methodical precision that most people attributed to musical perfectionism. At 68, he looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a retired accountant who had discovered a passion for church music late in life. What the congregation didn't know was that Thomas had never been an accountant. For 25 years, he'd been senior financial crimes investigator Thomas Wright, Treasury Department, specializing in money laundering operations that funded everything from drug cartels to international terrorism. He'd tracked dirty money through offshore accounts, shell corporations, and financial networks so complex that most people couldn't imagine how they worked. His retirement 3 years ago had been official. His attention to unusual financial patterns had been permanent. "Beautiful music this morning, Thomas," said Father Martinez after the early service, shaking his hand as parishioners filed out into the Sunday morning sunshine. "Thank you, Father," Thomas replied, but his eyes were following a man in an expensive suit who had arrived late, sat in the back pew, left a $100 bill in the collection plate, and departed before the sermon began. It was the fourth Sunday in a row the same man had followed the same pattern. What bothered Thomas wasn't the generosity, it was the mathematical precision of it. Exactly $100. Exactly 15 minutes after service began. Exactly the same seat, the same entrance, the same exit. In his former life, that kind of rigid routine usually meant someone was using a legitimate operation to clean illegitimate money. "Thomas?" Father Martinez was still standing there looking concerned. "Is everything all right?" "Just thinking about next week's music," Thomas said, which was technically true if you considered that he was thinking about how to position himself to observe collection patterns more carefully. After the congregation dispersed, Thomas stayed behind to practice, which gave him an excuse to watch the afternoon activities. St. Michael's rented its fellowship hall for community meetings, and today the monthly Downtown Business Association was holding their gathering. Thomas had noticed this group before. Well-dressed men who arrived in expensive cars, spoke in hushed tones, and always seemed to end their meetings with members making visits to Father Martinez's office, visits that invariably resulted in substantial donations to the church's building fund. From the organ loft, Thomas had a perfect view of the fellowship hall and the pastor's office. What he saw over the next hour would have looked completely normal to most observers. Business leaders discussing community development, making charitable contributions, supporting their local church. But Thomas Wright hadn't spent 25 years investigating financial crimes by accepting things at face value. The donations were too large for the size of the businesses involved. The participants drove cars that cost more than their company's reported annual revenues. And most importantly, the money being donated was always cash, always in specific denominations, and always accompanied by paperwork that looked more like financial transaction records than simple contribution receipts. That evening, Thomas did something he hadn't done since his official retirement. He made a phone call to a number that most people didn't know existed. Special Agent Carmen Rodriguez, Financial Crimes Division. Carmen, this is Tom Wright. There was a pause. Tom? It's been, 3 years? How's retirement treating you? Quietly, Thomas said, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a notebook full of observations that looked like musical notations, but weren't. Carmen, I need to run something by you. Hypothetically? Agent Rodriguez had worked with Thomas for 7 years. She knew that when Tom Wright called with hypothetical situations, they usually turned out to be very real problems that needed immediate attention. Go ahead. Thomas described what he'd observed, speaking in the careful language of someone who understood the difference between suspicion and evidence. Unusual donation patterns, cash transactions that didn't match reported business income, regular meetings that looked like coordination sessions rather than community development discussions. Tom, Rodriguez said, after he finished, you know we can't investigate churches based on donation patterns alone. I know, Thomas said, playing a soft chord progression on his home keyboard while he talked. But I also know that sophisticated money laundering operations often use charitable organizations as fronts. Your call. The next Sunday, Thomas was back at the organ for the early service, but this time he wasn't alone. Agent Rodriguez sat in the back pew, dressed like any other visitor, observing the same patterns that had caught Thomas's attention. During the offertory hymn, Thomas watched in his peripheral vision as the man in the expensive suit made his usual entrance, left his usual donation, and prepared for his usual early departure. But this time, Rodriguez was watching too, noting details with the trained eye of someone who understood what financial crime looked like when it was hiding behind religious devotion. After the service, Thomas stayed for the later worship, using his position at the organ to observe the afternoon business association meeting. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. The Downtown Business Association wasn't discussing community development. They were coordinating financial transactions using the church's donation system to process money that needed to be cleaned before it could be deposited in legitimate bank accounts. Father Martinez wasn't involved. He was being used. The criminals had found a trusting pastor who asked no questions about generous donations and provided receipts that could justify large cash deposits as charitable contributions. Thomas, Rodriguez said quietly, approaching the organ after everyone else had left, we need to talk. Over the next hour, Thomas provided the kind of detailed financial analysis that had made him legendary in the Treasury Department. Transaction patterns, timing correlations, behavioral indicators that suggested systematic money laundering rather than random charitable giving. How long have you been watching this? Rodriguez asked. 3 months of active observation, Thomas said, organizing his sheet music while he talked. But pattern recognition suggested something unusual after about 6 weeks. And you just happened to notice this from the organ bench? Thomas smiled. Carmen, I spent 25 years tracking dirty money through legitimate businesses, offshore accounts, and charitable organizations. Retirement doesn't turn off pattern recognition. It just changes the observation post. What happened next was 3 months of careful investigation that confirmed Thomas's analysis. The Downtown Business Association was actually a money laundering operation run by a local organized crime family using St. Michael's generous donation policies to clean approximately $2 million in illegal drug proceeds. The arrests were made on a Tuesday morning away from the church in a coordinated operation that protected both Father Martinez and the congregation from any involvement in the investigation. Father Martinez was devastated when he learned how his trust had been exploited. I just wanted to help the community, he told Thomas after the news broke. I never imagined... Father, Thomas said gently, predators count on good people not imagining evil. That's not a failing of faith. That's why communities need people who understand how predators think. The local news covered the story as a major money laundering operation disrupted by federal investigation, with no mention of the church organist who had identified the pattern or the financial crimes investigator who had provided the analysis that made the case possible. A few weeks later, Agent Rodriguez stopped by St. Michael's during Thomas's practice time. "We could use someone with your expertise as a consultant," she said, listening to him play a Bach prelude that sounded even more beautiful in the acoustic sanctuary. "Financial crime is getting more sophisticated. We need people who can spot patterns that computers miss." Thomas finished the piece and turned to face her. "I appreciate the offer, Carmen, but I think I'm exactly where I need to be." Playing organ in a small church? Thomas looked around the sanctuary, where families would gather tomorrow to worship, where children would learn about faith and community, where people came seeking peace in a complicated world. "Protecting the place where people come when they need to believe in something good," he said. "Someone needs to make sure that predators don't corrupt institutions that exist to help people." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "The church doesn't know who you really are, do they?" "They know I play organ and I care about this community," Thomas said. "That's all they need to know." Thomas Wright never told the congregation about his background in financial crimes investigation. He never mentioned the international money laundering cases he'd cracked or the terrorist financing networks he'd helped dismantle. He just played beautiful music, watched over his community, and stayed ready. But word spread quietly through law enforcement circles that if anyone noticed unusual financial patterns around charitable organizations in the downtown area, they should probably run it by the organist at St. Michael's. Not officially, of course, just as a professional courtesy to someone who understood how criminals thought and how legitimate institutions could be exploited. Every Sunday morning, Thomas continued his routine. He arrived early, arranged his music, played hymns that had comforted generations of worshipers, and kept his eyes open for patterns that didn't belong in a house of worship. Most Sundays, the biggest challenge was choosing between different arrangements of Amazing Grace. But some Sundays, when his trained instincts noticed something that needed attention, Thomas Wright was exactly where he needed to be, between the people who needed protection and the predators who would exploit their faith. Because that's what you do when you've spent your career following dirty money through the world's most complex financial systems. You don't stop when you retire. You just find a new way to protect the institutions that matter most, and sometimes the most vigilant guardian of a community's financial integrity is the person who looks like they're just trying to play beautiful music for Sunday morning worship. Thomas had spent 25 years tracking financial crimes that threatened national security. Now he spent his retirement making sure that one small church remained a place where people could give generously without having their faith exploited by criminals. The mission was the same. The stakes were the same. The only difference was that now, instead of briefing federal agents about international money laundering networks, he played hymns that reminded people why institutions of faith were worth protecting. And every Sunday, as the collection plates passed through the pews, Thomas Wright watched with the eyes of someone who knew the difference between charitable giving and criminal enterprise, ready to protect both the church and the community it served. So the next time you hear an organist playing beautiful music during a worship service, remember that some people retire from careers but never retire from protecting others. The person creating beauty at the keyboard might also be the person ensuring that beauty isn't corrupted by those who would exploit trust for profit. Have you ever met someone like Thomas? Someone whose retirement hobby was really just a different way of serving their community? Share their story in the comments below. Tell us about the quiet professionals who never stop protecting the institutions that matter most. Thank you for watching The Human Stories. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who believes in protecting faith communities from those who would exploit them. Because the world needs more people like Thomas Wright, professionals who understand that some missions are too important to end with retirement. Until next time, remember that guardians come in all forms. Sometimes they wear badges, sometimes they play church organs, but they're always watching for patterns that threaten the communities they've sworn to protect, always ready to ensure that places of worship remain sacred rather than corrupted. And sometimes the most beautiful music comes from someone who understands that protecting harmony requires vigilance against those who would introduce discord.